So a CBDC is money is software, software directly controlled by the government, meaning that the government can program each individual unit of the currency to only be spendable under the conditions that it decides. And so at that point, you have money transforming from a neutral arbiter of value into something like a, company store token that can only be spent, under the conditions that the company decides. Well, it's not really money at that point anymore. And so that's what's so interesting, is that it's actually Bitcoin that is preserving money as a thing, as an object, as a tool that is available to humanity, while these CBDCs are becoming fully politicized tokens that are used to exchange under politically favorable conditions.
Hello, guys. Welcome once again to BitCorner, the podcast for Bitcoiners from a Salvadorian to the world. Today, we have the great pleasure to have Natalie Smolenski here. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So Natalie, I'm a really big fan of you. I love all your work. And so it's a big pleasure for me and, of course, all our audience that you're here. And well, to start the episode, maybe for those people that don't know you, maybe could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background? I know that your family is from Poland and you're from the States, and you're from the States? Or do you want, how was it?
Yeah, so my parents immigrated to the United States from Poland in the early 1980s. And I'm the first person in my family born in the United States. I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and I'm still here today. I came to Bitcoin through a software startup that I was working at that partnered with MIT to make a digital identity wallet that used Bitcoin as a secure anchor of trust for digital identity claims. So, about 2015-ish was, when I first really heard of Bitcoin and started to dig into it and understand it. My company ended up producing both an open source technology implementation and a commercial SaaS product. And so when we spun out a startup to commercialize this product, I went with that company as the founding business development executive, and I was basically making a market for digital self-sovereignty based in Bitcoin ever since.
Wow, that's awesome. Did you mention digital IDs with the MIT? How does it work with Bitcoin?
Yeah, so anyone who uses the internet today uses some forms of digital ID. So if you have a username and password, that's a form of digital ID. If you have a public key, even transacting on the Bitcoin network, that's a kind of digital ID. And so we recognized early on that there was a lot of potential to abuse digital identity technologies for things like surveillance and monetization of personal data without consent. That's basically the business model of many of the consumer SaaS platform companies today. And we realized that in the same way that people need to be able to self-custody their digital money, they also need to be able to self-custody their digital identity. And because Bitcoin was already the most widely implemented, secure, self-sovereign financial network, we basically piggybacked on that to use it also for verification of digital claims.
Wow, wow, that's amazing. I didn't
Yeah.
heard about that. And so I know you studied you're an anthropologist, right?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
So how and why did you chose that specific career? What is your passion
Well,
about it?
yeah, I was interested in anthropology because I was interested in people. I grew up between cultures in Dallas, being raised in a Polish family in the United States. And so I felt like I was kind of between worlds. I didn't fully fit into the Polish community. I didn't fully fit into the American community always. But it made me very interested in culture. And cultural anthropology is the science of culture.
Hmm.
And so I kind of naturally gravitated to that field. I was particularly interested in how value circulates in human societies. So, notions of the sacred and the profane, the good and evil, and how that actually has economic inflections and how people negotiate um, the value of things and borders, between different social groups and social hierarchies. Who's important and who gets listened to and why. Um, and so I didn't ever intend to get into software, but my dissertation in anthropology um, was not legible to my committee at the time. They didn't understand really what I was trying to do, and so basically they told me that either I had to choose a completely different project or leave. And
Wow.
I always prefer to you know privilege my own project.
Yeah.
That's why I'm there. So I chose to leave. I made my way through initially, got a job as a brand planner at an advertising agency, and then moved into software. And this
Hmm.
company that I was working at, happened to partner with MIT to build this Bitcoin based digital identity
Hmm.
wallet. So I
Hmm.
became very interested in Bitcoin as a social phenomenon and started writing about it from kind of a more historical anthropological perspective, and continue to do that to this day.
And when was the year that you first heard about Bitcoin?
I think it was around 2015 when I first heard of it, and then the company built and released the BlockCerts digital identity standard in 2016, and we officially launched the company in 2017.
And the Texas Blockchain Council, are you the founder or co-founder or?
Yeah, so I sold the startup, the digital identity startup, to a company
Oh.
called Highland Software in 2020,
Mhm.
um, just before the pandemic shut everything down. So it was
Wow.
really one of those like, wow, kind of moments.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I had been doing to make a market for Bitcoin-based digital identity over the past few years was I had actually done a considerable amount of policy work, both in the United States and in the European Union, to
Hmm.
further the acceptance of Bitcoin as an identity technology. And so, when I heard that Lee Bratcher, was founding an organization to advocate for the Bitcoin industry in Texas, this was early 2020,
Hmm.
I immediately joined up with him, and we basically, co-founded and built the Texas Blockchain Council, which is a trade association representing the Bitcoin industry in Texas.
Hmm.
So I was the first, chairman of the board of that organization. I helped set it up, get legislation passed, helped author legislation. Um, then last year, beginning of 22, my focus shifted. So I stepped back a little bit from policy work because I felt that the Bitcoin community actually needed some rigorous social scientific engagement with how Bitcoin is transforming human societies. So I was seeing a lot of work being done on the policy front, and a lot of work being done on the technology front, but not a lot of work being done to ask, the bigger questions of why Bitcoin matters, why this policy work matters, why the United States should get behind Bitcoin adoption. Like what value does it have for the United States in particular, for the state of Texas in particular. And so I saw the need for an organization that would focus more on the research and education behind Bitcoin that could then become policy advocacy downstream. And so that's why I founded the Texas Bitcoin Foundation, which is a charity organization. So we don't lobby for industry. We don't, directly like engage in policy work. And that organization is our sole mission is to basically increase the understanding of Bitcoin and education of Bitcoin for ordinary people, for politicians, for industry leaders, for anyone who wants to learn. We do have both, an academic and a vocational focus. So we helped launch the first professional certification mining program at any university anywhere in the world, right here at Texas State Technical College. So if you want to go into Bitcoin mining as a career, there's now a career path for you in a Texas university system. We're also more on the scholarly side, publishing the first academic journal dedicated to Bitcoin and political economy. And so that journal, called the Satoshi Papers, will be coming out, relatively soon. And it contains articles from economists, social scientists, and others who are asking the question of, what a non-sovereign digital currency means for the nation state, particularly in this era of geopolitical realignments when, United States world supremacy can no longer be taken for granted.
And I wanted to ask you about your rabbit hole journey and basically what made you study Bitcoin. And do you remember the time that you said, okay, this is legit? And maybe when do you know that this thing, Bitcoin, is totally different from other blockchains, other cryptocurrencies? It has no basically point of comparison.
Yeah, certainly. So when I was at the software company I was at, and they began building the BlockCerts identity standard with MIT, the people leading that project were, fully convinced of Bitcoin's value proposition, first of all, as a form of verifiably scarce digital sound money, and as a censorship resistant protocol for the transfer of value. And so, I had the great fortune of being part of a world-class team that understood why Bitcoin was different. And then as I began to do my own research and dig into it, sort of solidified that value proposition. So I would say, initially it was a credit to my team, absolutely, for introducing me to Bitcoin and to its uniqueness in the quote unquote crypto space. And then over time, I was able to put out my own research, showing why this matters, particularly in an era of accelerated state surveillance, and a progressive closure of sort of the the aperture of liberty that we are witnessing worldwide.
Yeah, and actually I was watching, I don't remember if it was on Twitter or so, a couple weeks ago that you were making a speech, I think, or you were invited for a meeting with maybe IMF, I don't remember. You were talking about
Mm.
CBDCs, right? And
Yeah.
so normally on this podcast, I usually ask for my guests to kindly explain the difference between cryptos and Bitcoin, but I think you have a better approach and understanding, not about cryptos, but about CBDCs. So maybe for the person that they they don't have so much understanding of they are beginners on this space. Can you explain them what are CBDCs and maybe what are your concerns about it?
Yeah, so absolutely. So CBDCs are government's answer to cryptocurrency. As governments have watched cryptocurrencies gain in popularity and adoption, they have felt that cryptocurrencies threaten the government monopoly on the issuance of money. Now, government monopolies on money are actually fairly recent thing historically. For most of human history, money has been largely a bottom-up phenomenon. So, human societies valued some commodity, whether, it was shells or obsidian chips or, gold or silver. And then that commodity became standardized into more fungible tokens that could then be exchanged. Sometime, several thousand years ago, as the first large states started to form, governments began to realize that in order to maintain the armies that they would need to consolidate and expand their power, they were going to have to pay soldiers in a currency that could be easily spent wherever the state decided to wage war. And so the first forms of state-issued coinage began to appear, sort of in coincidence with the expansion of human empires. But that didn't get rid of other forms of non-state money, which sort of coexisted alongside these state-issued currencies. The vast majority of people didn't have actually access to state-issued money. There wasn't a lot of liquidity in those days, and so people had to measure transactions in other ways, primarily using ledgers, rather than even commodity exchanges. And so, the question of what is money is one that Bitcoin has raised. And in the 20th century, that we can sort of consider that century the peak of state monopoly on money issuance and also on planning of the monetary economy. So the central banking system really, it emerged in isolated examples in previous centuries, but it really became a global phenomenon in the 20th century. And, the United States Federal Reserve was founded in 1913. And that, has become sort of the central bank of not the whole world, but for many countries around the world, the central bank of central banks. And so, when Bitcoin was introduced, it was introduced as a direct challenge to the central bank monopoly over money. And central banks, unsurprisingly, didn't like that. And so it's taken them a few years, but they've now produced their answer to Bitcoin in central bank digital currencies. And their pitch to the people is that, Bitcoin is too volatile to serve as a store value or medium of exchange, in other words, to be an effective money. But hey, you trust your dollars. So this is just a digital version of the dollars that you already use every day. So much better than Bitcoin, right? Well, I mean, the problem with it is that it partakes of all of the weaknesses of a central bank issued digital currency, or a central bank issued currency. So, anyone who's been following the history of the US dollar is aware that it has been progressively devalued since its introduction. Today, I think it's lost, 98% of the value that it originally had in 1913. This devaluation, though, has happened slowly enough that a lot of people don't notice it. And so they consider it to be a stable store of value. It's not. And so, that's one weakness of CBDCs, is that it simply replicates the inflationary central bank currencies that are already problematic for that reason. But then it also adds on to that weakness the full programmability of the currency itself. So a CBDC is money is software, software directly controlled by the government, meaning that the government can program each individual unit of the currency to only be spendable under the conditions that it decides. And so at that point, you have money transforming from a neutral arbiter of value into something like a, company store token that can only be spent, under the conditions that the company decides. Well, it's not really money at that point anymore. And so that's what's so interesting, is that it's actually Bitcoin that is preserving money as a thing, as an object, as a tool that is available to humanity, while these CBDCs are becoming fully politicized tokens that are used to exchange under politically favorable conditions.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, while you were explaining this, I was thinking that at the beginning of the podcast you mentioned the word value. So do you think well, I was thinking two things. One, that everything that you explained, it was basically the story of the Bretton Woods Agreement, and but I also heard, and I think it was in, I don't remember if it was in on the Natalie podcast, that you mentioned the Bretton Woods III Agreement.
Yeah.
So first of all, what is that? And then I have another question. But first of all, what is that? Bretton Woods III. Can you
Yeah.
explain?
So Bretton Woods III is a term that some have used to describe the changing or the new global financial system that we're in today. So Bretton Woods one was, actually Bretton Woods was the location of a meeting that happened in 1944 by the Allied powers during the Second World War, to kind of hash out how the countries of Europe, which were completely devastated after the war, would create a financial basis for rebuilding their economies, because they were all broke. The United States had 3/4 of the world's gold at that point, because European countries had paid the United States for arms in gold. And so, but the United States also realized that, if we have all the collateral, then nobody can trade with us. And so we don't have any trade partners, and we need trade partners to grow our own economy. And so we needed to actually come to an agreement about what the global economic system would look like, so that we could all rebuild. And at that time, the gold standard was adopted. The U.S. dollar was pegged to a certain amount of gold, and many European currencies were in turn pegged to the U.S. dollar. That gold peg became a problem for the United States because we very quickly started outspending our ability to exchange dollars for gold, mostly by continuing to wage war. So, after the Second World War, we fought the Korean War, which put our country into debt for the first time since the World War. Then we fought in Vietnam. We fought in other conflicts, and that progressively, indebted the U.S. Treasury. And so in 1971, President Nixon announced the closure of the gold window. We would no longer convert U.S. dollars for gold. That was a big shock to the world. And, that was what created the regime of fiat currency that is not backed by anything other than sovereign fiat or will. So there's no commodity backing the value of the US dollar, and in turn, any currency that's pegged to the US dollar. That was Bretton Woods II. So sort of starting in 1971. That world order could only last as long as American military strength was powerful enough to ensure a fully American-led world order. And as long as we could kind of shadow back the dollar with oil. That was an agreement shortly after the closure of the gold window. We struck an agreement with Saudi Arabia to exclusively price oil in US dollars. And so these petrodollars became, in effect, oil came to kind of substitute for gold as a commodity backing for the dollar, but not in any direct way, in more of a symbolic way. That order has been fraying. The United States, like many military empires, vastly overextended itself, overspent on conflicts that it couldn't win. It didn't win. Most recently, Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, trillions of dollars were spent on those conflicts that ended in U.S. withdrawal. In the meantime, other countries have begun to push back against U.S. control of the oil, in effect, trade, global oil trade, by trading in other currencies other than U.S. dollars. And so that's undermined then the petrodollar basis for trusting the US dollar as a kind of stable store of value. And so now what we're seeing is a collapse in the confidence that people have in the American sovereign fiat that backs the dollar. So we're seeing a crisis of confidence in the state, in the American state, and an active push by America's rivals to remove themselves from dependence on the US controlled global financial system so that they can transact freely without having to go through the US banking system, which they have to do if they're transacting in dollars. And so all of that has led to Bretton Woods III, which is the era that we're in today, meaning that the collapse of the petrodollar as a global reserve system is well underway. With that, a collapse of US military hegemony, the rise of BRICS countries in political power, economic power, military power, and in an alternative currency. So the BRICS countries are developing their own SDR, special drawing rights currency that's backed by a basket of different national currencies and commodities. So it's a return to commodity money. And the rise of Bitcoin, which is a non-state, non-aligned, global, neutral digital currency. And so what's interesting about Bretton Woods III is that, it reflects the extent to which any currency issued by a government is a political tool. It is controlled and instrumentalized by the government issuing that currency. And a multipolar world in which people now have a choice. Do they want to transact in the dollar, which is the political tool of the US government, or the yuan, or the ruble, or the new BRICS currency, which is a political tool of those governments? Well, is there a possibility that we could have a money that's not the political tool of some government? Well, that is Bitcoin. And this is why Bitcoin is so important for human liberty.
It's really interesting because when back in the 80s, and for example in El Salvador we have our civil war. That's when it started, and many Salvadorians and of course many people from Central America run away, but especially in El Salvador because we have our civil war. And I have an uncle that went to America, to the United States, basically to chase the American dream, right? And now that you're explaining to me all of this, I always think how things have changed, because by that time people were they wanted to go to United States basically to chase the American dream, right? To have a stable life, financial security, maybe to have a home, and now apparently it's really difficult to chase that, right? So I was thinking that maybe by that time that was maybe that was the value of the American society, maybe that all people in Latin America and maybe around the world wanted to, that's why they wanted to go there. So but I was thinking, and that is connected for the thing that I was going to ask you before, that you mentioned the word value. So what is exactly a value system in a society?
Right. So human beings are meaning-making machines. We're always making meanings from the world around us. It's how we navigate the world. Some of those meanings we translate into language. Other of those meanings we translate into economic valuations. So, things like price, mechanisms of exchange, barter. We also, have a primal experience of value through human relationships themselves. So every human child grows up in relationship with other human beings who serve caretaking functions, for that child, poorly or well. The child develops attachments, prioritizes relationships of intimacy. And so these are basically, value is just one index of meaning, or one way that human beings index what something means. So, you can talk about different modalities of value, exchange value versus use value, and what's very interesting to me are those things in human societies that we would say don't have an exchange value, that are priceless, things that you couldn't pay me enough money for. And that's where we start to get into the realm of the sacred. And so that was my interest as an anthropologist of religion, is how do the things that are priceless, or that have infinite value from the point of view of human beings, how do they inflect the economies of exchange for everything else that does in fact have a price.
Yeah. Um, a couple days ago, I was reading an article that changing a little bit the subject, an article that you wrote for Forbes. I think it's your first article, right? That it
Oh
was
yeah, yeah.
congratulations, by the way.
Oh,
It
thanks.
was amazing, guys. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's called "Regulator Shutdown of Signature of SVB and Silvergate Banks and Raise Question About Neutrality." And in your article, you mentioned that the recent regulatory actions against banks serving the crypto industry have uh, highlighted the value of a politically neutral currency like Bitcoin, right? So can you explain why Bitcoin is a political neutral and how it's compared to fiat and cryptocurrencies in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So Bitcoin is politically neutral in several ways. One is from a monetary policy standpoint. So the monetary policy of Bitcoin is fixed by the protocol, and virtually impossible to change. So we know that only 21 million Bitcoin will ever be issued. The mining rewards reliably are cut in half every 4 years. Once all of the Bitcoin have been issued, that's all that there will be. Each Bitcoin is subdivisible into 100 million Satoshi. And then those all exist, in exchange pairs or trade pairs with other forms of currency. So that's a form of neutrality. If you contrast that with central banks, I mean, central banks can choose to print money or destroy money at will. And that's what the Federal Reserve is now doing. They, in effect, backstopped initially all of SVB's deposits, insured or uninsured, old or new, which is a significant action. I mean, it's a central bank committing to printing however much money is required for this particular institution to remain solvent. So that's already a political decision, choosing to favoritize this institution. But now we're hearing from the Fed that the central bank may backstop all U.S. banks, which is extraordinary, and relies on the Federal Reserve's ability to print unlimited amounts of money at any time. So again, that's fully political decision. Another way that Bitcoin is neutral is that there's no way to effectively censor transactions. So if I want to transact with you in Bitcoin, or anyone else at any time, if I'm running my own node of the Bitcoin software, there is no third-party intermediary who can decide that my transaction is invalid or violates some political or social norms and therefore cannot be anchored to the chain. It will go through. And so it's so there's monetary policy, there's censorship resistant transacting, there's also censorship resistant storage of Bitcoin. So I can hold my own Bitcoin on a wallet that I fully control, that I can choose to even keep permanently offline, never connect to a network device. But it is fully within my control as long as I have my seed phrase memorized. I can access and spend that money anywhere I choose. And so it's really these three elements of Bitcoin that render it politically neutral.
Mm. And you also mentioned in your article that the regulatory response to the crypto industry has been inconsistent and arbitrary. So do you think this lack of coherency in the regulatory approach to well, cryptos, because basically all there were related to cryptos, will eventually be resolved, or this is systemic, sorry?
Yeah, I think that I think the incoherence of the regulatory response to crypto is actually a symptom of the incoherence of the American project today. I think that the United States is in a political crisis, that people in the United States have vastly differing ideas about who we are as a country and who we should be as a country. Um, there are very strong factions on both the right and the left in the United States that see their vision of America as only possible with a strong and ever stronger state. So they're statist. They believe that the solutions to problems come top down through direct government intervention. And then there are other factions who would suggest that in fact many of these problems are self-inflicted by a state that has gotten too big and too interventionist, that is trying to make decisions way beyond its capacity to know even how to assess the problem. And so the reason the regulatory response to crypto has been incoherent is because all these factions have been battling it out, both in Washington and in state governments. And there's no consensus, no agreement on what the path forward should be. And this is one of the reasons that in my work for the Texas Bitcoin Foundation and the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I'm a fellow, I try to really emphasize the importance of the American history of liberty, particularly individual liberty, as the defining characteristic of the American project. Because otherwise, it's just going to be a battle between, this statist faction and that statist faction.
Yeah. And do you think that we're at the beginning of another real financial crisis, or this is just political, or it's a mix of everything?
Yeah, every financial crisis is always a political crisis because the financial system has been fully politicized for quite some time. And so what we saw in 2008 was that was a crisis where private lending by banks was basically way too risky. They took way too many risks. In fact, in some cases, engaged in outright fraud or malpractice, and went down. And the response of the government was to basically step in and put the resources of the state, both through money printing and taxpayer resources, to work to rescue these private institutions that had mismanaged customer funds. But what we're seeing today is a crisis of confidence in the sovereign itself. So, COVID sort of accelerated this. We were just before COVID, the U.S. central bank was starting to tighten, the money supply a little bit, like starting to pull back from its response to 2008. But then as soon as COVID happened, it started printing again. And then COVID kind of tapered off. And so we thought, okay, it's time to tighten again. The problem is when you have multi-decades of just injecting free liquidity into the system, you've created such vulnerability that the moment you start raising rates again, you crash the entire global economy. And so I think we're just at the beginning of that. I think it's going to get much worse.
Wow. Yeah, definitely. I believe so too. And one thing that I want to ask you is, well, related to the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. Recently, I think in a couple of weeks ago, you were visited by Max and Stacy and also Milena Mayorga. and you were
Yeah.
working with this for the second Bitcoin embassy, right? This is going to
Yes.
be the second one. So can explain to all Salvadorans what basically two questions. One, what is that a Bitcoin embassy and what are you working on with El Salvador on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Bitcoin Embassy is the name that the government of El Salvador has given to um, Salvadoran chambers of commerce in other countries. So that's the legal structure of the entity. It's a chamber of commerce. It's designed to facilitate trade between El Salvador and the country that it's in. So the first Bitcoin embassy was opened in Lugano in Switzerland,
Mhm.
and that project is underway. The second one is currently planned for Austin, Texas. And so my role in that was basically just to facilitate the meetings, the conversations between the governments of El Salvador and the state of Texas. Ultimately, as a 501c3 organization, we're not a representative of any government. We don't pass laws. We don't do that kind of direct policy work. So, now that we've helped bring these governments together, it's really going to be up to them to come to the agreements necessary to get the embassy opened. So that's kind of where it stands today.
Now that you're mentioning Texas, I know that Texas is, I think it's one of the states, maybe the top states that is working hardly on Bitcoin, especially on mining. So how is currently the situation over there in terms of maybe policies, legal terms, or how is the evolve of the Bitcoin mining in Texas?
Yeah, so Texas is still a global hub of Bitcoin mining. We saw a lot of mining activity relocate to Texas after China banned mining in 2021. We had a number of Chinese miners move into the state, but also miners from other parts of the country in the world who were having their mining operations shut down, or we're seeing political activity move against mining in their jurisdiction. And so Texas has benefited from being a very friendly state to Bitcoin miners from a regulatory standpoint and also from a culture standpoint. There's a lot of openness to Bitcoin here. The governor has openly expressed support. There are many champions of Bitcoin mining in the Texas state legislature. But there also is blowback. There's blowback first at the federal level. So last year, Senator Elizabeth Warren called for an investigation into the environmental impacts of Bitcoin miners in Texas and to their impacts on the energy grid. There are some legislators in Texas who oppose Bitcoin mining and want to see it curtailed. So it's a constant. We have to constantly be vigilant, and we can never get to the place where we just trust that the government's going to do the right thing. This is part of what democracy means, and part of what freedom means is that the citizens have to be constantly engaged and pushing back, because the moment we step back, that's the moment that our liberties get taken from us, and then it's a lot more work to get back liberties than it is to preserve the ones you already have.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And Natalie, we have around 7 minutes. Wow,
Yeah,
super quick. So just to start and wrap it up, I think I have maybe two or three more questions for you. And
sure.
one is, how do you think that Bitcoin is changing the way people think about trust and transparency also? Now that
Yeah.
people are starting to be aware or waking up about basically the meaning of money, right? The real meaning of money.
No, absolutely. I think the main objection to Bitcoin adoption to date has been, at least in the United States, that people have trusted the US dollar. They've fundamentally trusted that the US dollar will continue to keep its value, and that the US government will conduct policy in a way that preserves the value of that dollar. I think over the past just few months, but certainly over the past few years, that trust has dramatically dropped. I think a lot of people in the United States are beginning to say for the first time, I'm concerned that my money isn't going to be worth as much in,
Wow.
a few years than it is today. And that's not a problem that Americans have had. Like I said, inflation in the United States has generally happened slowly enough that people have generally felt secure.
So do you think
Um,
it's, sorry to interrupt, do you think it's way
yeah.
worse than 2008, the situation?
Uh, oh yeah. Yeah. This is in 2008, people turned their anger against the banks.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Oh,
and,
okay.
and
I see
there,
the difference.
yeah. And there was definitely a drop in trust in government because the government was seen as just giving the banks a blank check to fool around. But this time it's a lot worse. It's that, the government itself has created this problem that the banks are actually trying their best to respond to, but they can't because the system has been set up, the system of fractional reserve lending, that is the government endorsed business model for banks, is the very problem.
Mm.
And so I think that we're going to see a major uptick in Bitcoin adoption in the United States in the coming years.
Wow. And uh, going back to the Texas Bitcoin Foundation, what are you mainly working on right now there this year under foundation?
Yeah, so this year our main project, well, we facilitated that connection between the Salvadoran government and the government of Texas. So
It's a
we're
great
very
achievement.
yeah, we're very proud of that. We also have launched the Satoshi Papers, which is that academic journal I was telling you about.
Hmm.
So my main goal as editor in chief of that journal is to get all of the pieces ready for publication. I also have to write my own contribution to it, so that's going to be a big focus. But I think it's going to be really, really good. And it's the kind of thing that not everyone will read because it can be difficult to read academic articles, but having them is very important because
Hmm.
policymakers, scientists, industry leaders, they need to have that kind of research to cite so that they can continue to do the more publicly accessible work that they do.
Okay, okay. Wow, that's perfect. And I think the last question will be if have you orange pilled your family yet?
Yeah, I think I was telling Natalie Brunell this. My parents were very skeptical of Bitcoin at first, in large part because they had so much faith in the US dollar and the
Okay.
US financial system. But, I think they're beginning to see the ways in which that system at the very least isn't perfect and probably doesn't hurt to have a backup plan. Um, and I think that's how a lot of people, it's not that they're fully orange pilled or maximalists, but they're saying to themselves, just in case, maybe I should get some.
Yeah, definitely. That's actually
Yeah.
that's what happened to my parents and I mean my dad is way I think he's orange pill at what 100%. Not maximalist,
Yeah.
but yeah. But my mom I think is currently and now she's beginning to see that, especially in the changes that already saw with Bitcoin and the governmental Salvador that the things are changing. So I think
Yeah.
that's so, okay, Natalie Smolenski, thank you for being here. Again, thank you for your time. And it was a really pleasure to have you here on BitCorner.
Yeah. Wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, guys, see you next week.